I was standing in my backyard, hose in hand, trying to water the roses my late wife planted, when the stream suddenly weakened, sputtered, and died. 1 second I was watering her favorite flowers, the next I was staring at dry dirt and a dead hose. At first, I thought a pipe had burst or the city was doing maintenance. Then I noticed the bright orange notice zip tied to my gate like a warning label on my life. Water service terminated for HOA violations. I just stood there, rereading it, waiting for it to make sense. It didn't. I'd never missed a payment, never had a serious complaint. I followed the rules. I kept my yard clean. I stayed out of drama. But according to the HOA president, water wasn't a right, it was a privilege, and she had decided I no longer deserved it. Anger hit me like a wave. I dropped the hose and walked straight down to the pump house, my heart pounding. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. The valve had been physically shut off, not by the city, not by some accident, but by someone who had put their own lock on it, a lock I didn't recognize, a lock I didn't authorize. That's when it stopped being confusing. That's when it became personal. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a billing error. This was retaliation. And what the HOA president didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood knew, was that the water she had just shut off didn't belong to the city. It belonged to me. That well had been drilled by my grandfather decades ago, long before the subdivision existed. Every single home around me was quietly drawing water from my land, through my pump, through my system. And she had just cut it off like she owned it. She thought she was punishing me. What she had actually done was cut off the entire neighborhood and handed me the keys to the biggest mistake of her life. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I had lived in Cedar Ridge Estates for over 15 years. It was the kind of place realtors described as peaceful. Tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, kids riding bikes until the streetlights came on, neighbors who waved instead of stared. It wasn't flashy, but it was home. My home. What most people didn't realize, though, was that my property didn't belong to Cedar Ridge in the same way theirs did. My land came first. Decades before the HOA ever existed, my grandfather bought 10 acres here after World War II. He built a modest farmhouse with his own hands and, more importantly, drilled a deep well because municipal water didn't reach this far at the time. That well became the lifeline of the property, steady, reliable, and strong enough to support far more than just one house. Years later, when a developer named Robert Hale came along and decided to build Cedar Ridge Estates around my land, he came to me personally. I still remember him sitting at my kitchen table, coffee in hand, saying, "What can build around you? But we'll need water." The deal was simple and fair. I'd allow the neighborhood to connect to my well in exchange for a maintenance agreement, a utility easement, and legal documentation that clearly stated the HOA would never own or control the water system. They would benefit from it, yes, but ownership and authority stayed with me. Everything was signed, everything was recorded with the county. Everything was done the right way. And for years it worked perfectly. The water flowed. The neighborhood thrived. No one complained. No one questioned it. The HOA barely mentioned the water system at all. It was just there. Quiet, reliable, invisible. Just like me, I paid my dues. I followed the rules. I kept my yard clean. I stayed out of HOA politics. I didn't attend meetings unless absolutely necessary. I wasn't anti-HOA. I just didn't want drama. I wanted peace. And I had it until Melissa Hart became HOA president. Melissa had moved into the neighborhood about 3 years earlier, and from the moment she showed up, something felt off. She wasn't friendly. She was official. She didn't introduce herself. she announced herself. Within months, she was on the board. Within a year, she was president. And that's when everything changed. Suddenly, rules that no one had ever heard of before started appearing in our inboxes. Trash cans couldn't be visible for more than 10 minutes after pickup. Holiday decorations had to come down within 48 hours. Lawn edges had to be trimmed to a uniform aesthetic standard, whatever that meant. Fines were handed out like parking tickets. But what really set the tone was the way she communicated. She didn't send reminders. She sent warnings. She didn't offer help. She offered penalties. She didn't talk to people privately. She publicly shamed them in mass emails. One neighbor got fined for having a basketball hoop in his driveway, even though it had been there for years. Another was cited because their grass was half an inch over regulation height. A retired couple received a violation because their mailbox post was visually outdated. It was exhausting. Still, I stayed out of it. I kept my head down. I told myself it wasn't my fight. I told myself, as long as I follow the rules, I'll be fine. And I did, until one afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found a violation notice addressed to me. Unauthorized landscaping modifications. I stared at the paper, confused. My yard hadn't changed in years, except for one thing: a rose bush. The original rose bush by my front porch had died earlier that season. My wife had planted it years before she passed, and when it withered, it felt like losing a small piece of her all over again. I replaced it with a new one, same size, same color, same spot. That was my violation. I appealed. Politely, I wrote a calm email explaining the situation. I even attached photos. The old bush, the new bush, the location, everything. I assumed this was a misunderstanding. Melissa denied it, no explanation, no compromise, just a cold, formal rejection. Then came the fine. Not small either. Large enough to feel punitive. Not corrective. I paid it. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want trouble. Then came the warning letter. Further noncompliance may result in loss of community privileges. That wording stuck with me. Privileges. It didn't sit right. But I still didn't think she'd go as far as she did. Because one afternoon, without warning, without notice, without a final letter or phone call, my water stopped. No gradual decline, no pressure warning, just off. And standing there, staring at a dry hose, I realized something had shifted. This wasn't about roses anymore. This wasn't about landscaping. This wasn't even about rules. This was about power. And Melissa Hart had just decided to test how much she really had on the wrong man, on the wrong property, and on the wrong system. And she had no idea what she just touched. The first thing I did was try to handle it like a reasonable adult. I walked into the HOA office with the violation notice in my hand, my voice calm, my tone respectful. I wasn't angry yet, just confused and trying to fix what I assumed was a misunderstanding. Melissa Hart barely looked up from her laptop. "You didn't submit an architectural request form," she said flatly. I blinked. "It's a rose bush," I replied. "The same rose bush that's been there for 15 years. I just replaced a dead one." She finally looked at me and smirked. Rules are rules. That smirk did something to me. Not anger, not rage. Something colder, something sharper. I took a breath and said, "My water was shut off. That's not a landscaping issue. That's a utility issue." She shrugged. "Water is an amenity provided by the association," she said, as casually as if she were talking about access to a pool. "If you're not in compliance, you lose access." I stared at her. "An amenity," I repeated. "That's drinking water, that's showers, toilets, basic living." She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "You should have thought about that before breaking the rules." My patience cracked. Who authorized a contractor to enter my property and tamper with utility equipment? I asked. She didn't hesitate. I did. No apology. No hesitation. No concern. That was the moment everything changed, because this wasn't about landscaping. This wasn't about compliance. This was about control, and she wanted me to know she had it. I walked out of the office without saying another word, not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd realized saying anything in that moment would only make things worse. And for the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not helplessness, resolve. Over the next few days, things started to unravel across the neighborhood. Water pressure dropped. Showers went cold halfway through. Sprinklers sputtered and shut off. Dishwashers failed mid-cycle. At first, people assumed it was a city issue. Then the HOA forum exploded with complaints. Anyone else losing water pressure? Our shower barely works. Is anyone else's sink just dripping? Melissa responded with a single post. City maintenance issue. No action required at this time. But I knew better, because I knew where that water came from, and I knew exactly who had shut it off. Neighbors started knocking on my door. Do you know what's going on? Is your water out too? Did the HOA say anything to you? I told them what I could, carefully, calmly, without revealing everything yet. But their frustration mirrored mine, and the tension in the neighborhood was rising. Meanwhile, Melissa escalated. She sent out an email stating that temporary water restrictions might be necessary and hinted at upcoming infrastructure assessments. It felt like she was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something expensive, something dishonest. That's when I went home, went into my study, and pulled out the box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were the original deed records, the utility easement agreements, the well drilling logs, the maintenance contracts, the documents my grandfather had kept and I had inherited, proving ownership, responsibility, and authority over the water system that quietly served every home in Cedar Ridge Estates. I spread them out across my desk and read through every page. And the more I read, the clearer it became Melissa had no legal authority over that well. None. She had trespassed. She had interfered with a private utility. She had endangered public health. And she had done it knowingly. That's when I made the call. I dialed my old friend Daniel Cruz, a retired military attorney who now specialized in property law. We'd served together years ago, and he was the kind of man who didn't just know the law. He understood strategy. I explained everything. The violations, the shoot-off, the threats, the documents. There was a pause on the line as he reviewed the photos I emailed him. Then he laughed, not nervously, not awkwardly, but confidently. This, he said, is going to be fun. And for the first time since the water went out, I smiled, because I realized something. Melissa thought she had taken something from me. In reality, she had just handed me everything I needed to take my power back, legally, publicly, and permanently. Daniel confirmed what I had long suspected. Melissa was crossing lines she had no right to touch. The list was shocking, but not surprising. Trespass, utility interference, fraud, abuse of authority. Each violation alone would have been enough to raise alarm, but together, they painted a portrait of someone who had overstepped every boundary a homeowner, or human, should respect. The most crucial point, the one that made my blood boil every time I thought of it, was this: she had no legal authority over the well. No ownership, no permission, no mandate. And yet, she acted like it was hers to control, restricting water access, spreading misinformation, and leveraging fear to manipulate the neighborhood. We didn't rush into confrontation. Rushing in would have played into her hands, and Daniel and I both knew it. Melissa thrived on chaos and intimidation. She wanted people reacting emotionally, scrambling, making mistakes that could be used against them. We needed evidence. Hard, undeniable proof. I started with the pump house. Cameras went up in discreet corners, recording every movement. I double-checked angles, ensuring every entrance, every valve, every access point was covered. Then we gathered written complaints. Neighbors who had been quietly suffering under her arbitrary restrictions were now willing to put their experiences into words. Each letter, each statement, added weight to the growing mound of evidence. We dug deeper. HOA bylaws, county records, state utility codes. Every document was pulled, cross-referenced, and analyzed. Every line we found confirmed what we already knew. Melissa had no authority, no legal justification, and no moral ground for her actions. She was building a house of lies and hoping no one noticed the cracks. And she noticed. Oh, she noticed. Melissa's escalation came swift and calculated. She sent an emergency notice to the entire neighborhood, using words designed to panic. Critical infrastructure failure, she claimed. The notice outlined a special assessment, $2,000 per household, to fund repairs that, in reality, didn't exist. Panic is a powerful weapon, and she wielded it like a sword, hoping fear would make compliance automatic. Then the door knockings began. One by one, neighbors came to me, confusion and concern etched on their faces. "Do you know anything about this water issue?" asked Mrs. Allen, her voice tight with worry. "Why are our faucets barely working?" "Mr. Ramirez demanded, frustration boiling beneath his calm exterior. This doesn't feel right," said a young couple, clutching their toddler. Fear in their eyes. I spoke carefully, revealing just enough truth to build trust, but not enough to tip our hand. They didn't need to know every strategy, every recorded video, every legal loophole we had uncovered. Not yet. They needed to see that someone was on their side, that someone was fighting for them. And they did. Eyes widened, hands relaxed, shoulders straightened. The momentum was shifting, the pressure was building, an invisible wave rolling toward Melissa that she couldn't see coming. She had assumed her position of power was unshakable, her control absolute. But for every lie she spread, for every intimidation tactic she used, we had evidence, witnesses, and the law itself ready to push back. I could almost feel the shift in the air. The neighborhood, once quiet and hesitant, was now buzzing with quiet murmurs of truth. Conversations that had been whispered behind fences and doors were now being voiced openly. A sense of empowerment spread. Fear, her chosen weapon, was losing its edge. Melissa, meanwhile, remained oblivious. She continued her campaign, oblivious to the web of accountability slowly tightening around her. Every call she made, every notice she sent, every demand she issued was being documented. Every action taken against the community became another brick in the wall we were building, a wall that would eventually trap her, lies behind the unyielding strength of truth. I stood in the pump house one evening, reviewing footage, reading letters, cross-checking codes, and I realized something. This wasn't just about water. It wasn't just about one neighborhood or one overreaching HOA leader. This was about power, about responsibility, about the courage it takes to stand against someone who believes rules don't apply to them. And we were ready. Melissa had no idea what was coming. She thought she was untouchable, that panic would be enough to bend the neighborhood to her will. But we had patience, evidence, and the quiet certainty of justice on our side. The moment of reckoning was approaching, inevitable as sunrise. And when it hit, it wouldn't be messy or emotional. It would be precise, undeniable, and final. Every complaint, every violation, every abuse of authority would be laid bare. The neighborhood would see the truth, and Melissa's reign of fear would end. In that moment, standing among the quiet hum of the pump and the faint scent of earth and water, I felt a surge of resolve. This was our turning point, not a moment of confrontation, but a moment of preparation, of gathering strength and truth until the scales of justice tipped in favor of right. Melissa thought she controlled the water. She didn't. She had underestimated the people she thought were powerless, the law she thought she could ignore, and the quiet force of determination that refuses to back down. And soon she would learn just how wrong she was. Daniel and I had spent days, nights, and more hours than I could count drafting the new water utility easement and service agreement. It was meticulous, airtight, and, above all, just every word, every clause, every paragraph had been crafted to ensure that no single person, especially Melissa, could ever manipulate the neighborhood's water supply again. The agreement stripped the HOA of any authority over the well and placed control squarely in the hands of an independent water board made up of homeowners. It guaranteed uninterrupted water access for every resident. Maintenance would be transparent, with reports and audits available for anyone to review. There were clear penalties for interference, and most importantly, a permanent legal lockout preventing Melissa from ever meddling with the system again. It was perfect on paper, but perfection on paper meant nothing if no one knew about it. The community had to see the truth. Melissa's power relied on secrecy, manipulation, and fear. Exposure was the only weapon strong enough to cut through it. We had our moment, the emergency HOA meeting. The room was packed, buzzing with tension. Neighbors filled every chair, leaned against walls, and even stood in the back. Faces that had once avoided eye contact now glared with frustration, suspicion, and fear. Rumors had spread, questions had piled up, and Melissa, confident as ever, seemed ready to quell them all with her usual charm and authority. She strode to the front, clipboard in hand, exuding that smug certainty she always carried. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, practiced. "We are facing a critical infrastructure issue. Our equipment is aging, our pipes are failing, and immediate action is required. I am recommending a special assessment of $2,000 per household to fund necessary repairs." Every eye in the room fixed on her, some nodding uncertainly, others frowning in confusion. Not once did she mention that the water hadn't failed because of old pipes or equipment. Not once did she admit that she had personally ordered the shutoff. That crucial detail, the heart of the matter, was missing, hidden behind a wall of intimidation and misinformation. She motioned for a vote, confident that fear and uncertainty would carry her through. And that's when I decided it was time. I stood. "Before you do that," I said, my voice steady, carrying over the murmur of the room. The room went silent. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes were on me. I walked to the front, deliberately slow, and placed a thick stack of documents on the table. The papers were crisp, heavy with evidence, every page a nail in the coffin of Melissa's authority. "I own the well," I said, letting the words hang. Gasps rippled through the crowd, like wind through dry leaves. Neighbors whispered, some mouths opening and closing in disbelief. Melissa's confident smile faltered, just slightly, but it was enough to see that the first crack had formed. "And Melissa Hart," I continued, voice calm but firm, "illegally shut it off." The room erupted. Questions fired in all directions. Neighbors shouted over each other, pointing, accusing, demanding explanations. I stayed composed, letting the evidence speak. I spread the documents across the table. Photos from the cameras at the pump house, written complaints from neighbors, copies of HOA bylaws, county records, and state utility codes. Each page told the same story. Melissa had no legal authority. She had acted alone. She had violated the rights of every homeowner connected to that well. Daniel stepped forward, adding context. "We've drafted a water utility easement and service agreement that places control with an independent water board. It guarantees access, ensures transparency, and permanently removes any single individual from wielding undue authority over the system." I could see the shift in the room. Confusion turned into understanding, fear into relief, and frustration into quiet empowerment. People realized that what they thought was unchangeable, the water shutoff, the panic, the extortion attempt, was now exposed for what it truly was. Melissa's voice trembled as she tried to interject, to reclaim control, to twist the narrative. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. She could talk, she could plead, she could glare, but the facts were unmovable. Every document, every testimony, every law cited made her position impossible. Neighbors began asking about the new agreement, wanting to know how they could vote to implement it immediately. The room's energy shifted from anger to action, from fear to agency. Melissa, once the orchestrator of panic, was now the center of scrutiny, her credibility crumbling with every passing second. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear the tide had turned. Melissa's control was broken. The neighborhood had seen the truth. The well was secure, the water flowing, and justice, quiet, deliberate, and undeniable, had been restored. And as I walked out, Daniel at my side, I realized something profound. Power isn't about authority or fear. True power comes from knowledge, preparation, and the courage to act when the time is right. Melissa had thought she was untouchable. She had underestimated the community, underestimated the law, and underestimated the people willing to stand together. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood the lesson. No one, no matter how confident, is above the law. Melissa laughed. Not a quiet chuckle, not a nervous giggle, a full, sharp, almost hysterical laugh that bounced off the walls of the packed HOA meeting room. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "The HOA controls the utilities. That's just the way it's always been." I didn't respond. I let Daniel handle it. He stood beside me, calm and unshakable, radiating the quiet authority of someone who knows the law, knows the facts, and knows the truth will win. "No," he said firmly. "The HOA benefits from the utilities. It does not own them. They are legally controlled by the homeowners, and this easement makes that official." With precise movements, Daniel began distributing copies of the water utility easement agreements to everyone in the room. He handed out county records, affidavits from the contractor Melissa herself had hired, and even documentation showing the shut-off order she had issued. The same contractor who, reluctantly but truthfully, admitted under oath that she had been instructed by Melissa to close the valve. Melissa's face shifted. Not anger, not indignation, not even the slightest spark of defiance. Fear. It was subtle at first, a tightness around her mouth, a slight blink too many, hands that no longer rested confidently at her sides. But it grew as she realized the scope of what was in front of her. Every lie, every attempt at manipulation, every ounce of intimidation was now on paper, undeniable, witnessed, and undeniable. Then the neighbors reacted. "You lied to us," a man shouted from the back. "You shut off our water," yelled another, voice cracking with anger and disbelief. "You tried to charge us $2,000 for something you caused," cried a young mother, gripping her child's hand. The room erupted into a mix of outrage, fear, and relief. People were finally voicing what had been gnawing at them for weeks, months even. And every accusation, every shout, was met with evidence in Daniel's hands. The board members, who had until now watched the confrontation unfold in uneasy silence, were stunned. Eyes darted between documents, murmurs spreading like wildfire across the room. Tom Whitaker, a long-time board member who had previously nodded along with Melissa's announcements without question, stood. His voice was steady but loaded with disbelief. "Melissa, is this true?" Melissa tried to speak. She hesitated, searching for words, looking for a way to reclaim control. She tried to deflect, to spin, to shift blame onto aging pipes, contractors, or vague Miscommunications. Her gestures became frantic, eyes darting, lips twitching, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. Each document, affidavit, and record pointed directly to her. Every attempt at manipulation collapsed under the weight of proof. She had been exposed, and the neighborhood knew it. Daniel turned to the crowd, his tone measured but commanding. "This," he said, holding up the new easement agreement, "is how water will be managed going forward, without HOA interference. Control will be in the hands of the homeowners through an independent water board. Access is guaranteed. Transparency is guaranteed. Interference will be met with legal consequences." A murmur ran through the room. Relief. Empowerment. People leaned in, reading over the copies in front of them, nodding, pointing, discussing quietly but decisively. The energy had shifted completely. Melissa's gaze flicked from document to document, from neighbor to neighbor. Every stare, every muttered question, every accusation chipped away at the facade of control she had so carefully built. She had thought herself untouchable because fear had silenced everyone around her. But fear had evaporated. The truth was now undeniable. The room had turned on her. You can't do this," Melissa finally blurted, voice cracking with tension, trying to reclaim authority that no longer existed. "Yes, we can," Daniel said, calmly, almost quietly, letting the gravity of the words settle. "Because the law and the facts are on our side, and because the community deserves water access, fair management, and transparency, without anyone's personal agenda interfering." Melissa's shoulders sagged just slightly. Her attempts to manipulate, to control, to intimidate were failing in real time. The crowd's murmurs of agreement grew louder. Neighbors who had once been timid, who had felt powerless against her, were now standing tall, witnessing their rights being restored. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a moral one. A community reclaiming what was theirs, refusing to be bullied by someone who had thought rules didn't apply to her. And in that moment, Melissa realized, too late, that she had lost. Control, influence, fear, authority, all of it had slipped through her fingers. The HOA could no longer touch the well. The water board would govern, enforce, and protect. And the neighborhood. They were stronger, wiser, and united. Daniel and I exchanged a brief glance, a quiet acknowledgement of the long hours, the research, the strategy, and the patience that had brought this moment into being. Justice had been meticulous, deliberate, and unstoppable. Melissa may have laughed at the beginning of the meeting, but by the end, the room was filled with a very different sound, murmurs of satisfaction, nods of approval, and the quiet confidence of a community that had finally reclaimed its power. And Melissa, she had nowhere left to hide. The vote was unanimous. Every hand in the room went up. Every voice confirmed it. Melissa Hart was removed as HOA president on the spot. The room erupted with a mix of relief, disbelief, and vindication. After weeks of fear, manipulation, and intimidation, the community had finally reclaimed control. The water board was established immediately, composed entirely of homeowners who were committed to transparency, fairness, and accountability. They would oversee maintenance, manage the well, and ensure uninterrupted water access, a system designed to prevent any one person from ever seizing control again. The special assessment she had tried to impose, $2,000 per household for a problem she had caused, was canceled instantly. Murmurs of gratitude rippled through the crowd. People who had been fearful of paying for a false crisis now shared smiles, hugs, and quiet laughter, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the room for months. I walked out of the meeting, Daniel by my side, and headed to the pump house. My heart pounded as I reached the valve, the very device Melissa had so arrogantly wielded as a tool of control. With a simple turn, I reopened the flow of water. Within minutes, faucets across the neighborhood sputtered, gurgled, and then flowed freely. Kitchens, bathrooms, and gardens came back to life. The sound of running water, something so ordinary yet so essential, carried through the streets like a victory anthem. Neighbors came running. People cried, people cheered. They hugged one another, laughed with relief, and shared stories of how they had managed without water for days, weeks, or longer. Children played in the spray of garden hoses. Adults wiped tears from their eyes, overwhelmed by the simple joy of restored normalcy. Melissa stormed out of the building, face red, fists clenched, and eyes blazing with fury. Humiliated and exposed, she had no words left, no authority to cling to, no community support remaining. She had been stripped of the power she had so recklessly abused, and it showed in every furious step she took as she left. But the fight for accountability didn't end there. Daniel filed civil claims against her personally, holding her responsible for the unlawful shutoff, the misrepresented assessments, and the financial and emotional damage caused to the neighborhood. The contractor she had coerced into shutting off the water was reported for unlicensed work, exposing yet another layer of negligence and misconduct. The HOA launched a full audit of her actions, diving into months of records, notices, and financial statements. What emerged was worse than anyone expected. Misused funds, falsified notices, intimidation tactics, and deliberate mismanagement. Every lie, every scheme, every act of manipulation was documented and verified. Melissa, realizing there was no way to recover her credibility or regain her position, resigned from the board entirely. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief, finally free from the shadow of her authority. Weeks turned into months. By the time 3 months had passed, Melissa put her house up for sale. She moved away quietly, leaving behind a community that was stronger, wiser, and more united than before. Her departure was final, a symbolic and literal closing of a chapter that had caused so much tension, fear, and uncertainty. The water board continued its work, maintaining the well, enforcing transparency, and ensuring that no one could ever seize control again. The community learned an important lesson: accountability matters. Preparation matters. Courage matters. And for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt safe again. People trusted one another, worked together, and knew that power would always be checked by truth, evidence, and the collective will of those who refused to be intimidated. I looked around as neighbors returned to their homes, their faucets running, their lives uninterrupted. Daniel and I exchanged a glance, a quiet nod that said everything: we had done it. The battle had been long, the stakes high, but justice had prevailed. Melissa Hart had underestimated the strength of a community united. She had underestimated the patience and diligence of those willing to stand up, collect evidence, and act decisively, and she had certainly underestimated the law. In the end, she lost not because of anger or confrontation, but because of truth, preparation, and unwavering resolve. The neighborhood had water again. The community had control again. And life, ordinary and extraordinary in its simplicity, flowed back into the streets. And Melissa, she was gone. Her reign of fear, her false authority, her manipulation, all of it erased. The climax wasn't loud or violent. It didn't need to be. It was legal, it was decisive, and it was complete. For the homeowners, it was a moment of liberation, a story they would tell for years. And for me, it was a reminder that courage, patience, and the unshakable pursuit of justice can topple even the most entrenched power. The well ran freely. The community thrived. And the shadow of Melissa Hart was finally behind us. The neighborhood transformed. It didn't happen overnight, but the change was unmistakable. Without Melissa's iron grip, people started talking again. Conversations that had been whispered behind curtains and fences became laughter shared across driveways. A sense of ease returned, subtle at first, then growing into full, vibrant life. Children played outside. Bikes rolled down sidewalks. Ball games erupted on lawns that had once been eerily quiet. Parents watched with relaxed smiles, no longer glancing nervously over their shoulders, no longer fearing what arbitrary rule or interference might come next. Neighbors began hosting barbecues and block parties. Smells of grilled food drifted across yards, mingling with the fresh scent of flowers and freshly cut grass. People exchanged stories, advice, and jokes. Bonds that had been frayed under months of tension began to knit together again, stronger than before. The water board quickly established a routine of transparency. Monthly reports were published detailing maintenance schedules, repairs, and usage. Every homeowner could access the records, ask questions, and participate in decisions. What had once been a source of fear and uncertainty became a model of community governance. The HOA revised its bylaws. Term limits were introduced to prevent the accumulation of unchecked power. Checks and balances were enforced. No one could again dominate the neighborhood through secrecy, fear, or manipulation. Every voice mattered. Every action was accountable. As for me, I returned to the small, familiar joys I had almost forgotten amid the chaos. I went back to my garden. I replanted the roses I had tended for years. Rich red blooms that seemed to glow brighter now, as if celebrating their freedom alongside the neighborhood. I installed a bench near the pump house. Sometimes I would sit there in the quiet, letting the gentle hum of the well fill the air around me. The same hum my grandfather had heard when he drilled it nearly 80 years ago. A sound so ordinary it was easy to take for granted, yet so vital it connected generations. It reminded me of resilience, of perseverance, and of the simple, enduring truth that water, like justice, should flow freely. I watched neighbors walk past, carrying groceries or chatting with friends. I saw kids splash in sprinklers, their laughter ringing louder than any argument that had ever been shouted in the HOA meeting room. The community thrived, not because someone had controlled it, but because people had taken responsibility for it together. The water flowed freely again, not because someone allowed it, but because it was always meant to. It was a hum of continuity, of life, and of a promise kept. And in that simple, steady rhythm, the neighborhood found its heartbeat once more. The lesson was clear. Melissa's reign had been a harsh one, but it taught something invaluable. Power, without accountability, doesn't protect communities. It controls them. It isolates them. It instills fear rather than trust. And when that power is finally checked, the relief is almost tangible, like water bursting through a long sealed pipe, rushing in to fill every crack, every dry corner, every thirsty home. The community had learned that lesson well. They had discovered the strength in unity, in patience, in preparation, and in standing together when faced with manipulation. They had learned that laws, bylaws, and transparency were not abstract rules, but lifelines for neighborhoods, guiding fair treatment and collective responsibility. And as I sat on the bench by the pump house, letting the hum of the well mingle with the distant laughter of children and the murmurs of neighbors, I felt a quiet, deep satisfaction. The struggle had been long, the obstacles formidable, but the outcome was undeniable. Peace, trust, and freedom had returned. Life in the neighborhood had returned to normal, yet it felt richer, stronger, and more resilient than it ever had before. It was the calm after the storm, the hum after the silence, the bloom after a harsh winter. Melissa was gone. Her manipulation, fear, and deceit were finally in the past. What remained was something far stronger, a community that had taken control, safeguarded its own future, and rediscovered the meaning of true home. And as the sun dipped low over the rooftops, casting warm light over lawns, gardens, and the well, I understood something fundamental. Justice, like water, is not meant to be hoarded, hidden, or controlled by a single hand. It is meant to flow, to sustain, and to nurture everyone it touches. The neighborhood had survived. It had learned, it had grown, and the water, steady, clear, and life-giving, reminded everyone, silently but insistently, that some things, by their very nature, are meant to be free. Looking back, I never wanted a fight. I just wanted to water my garden. But what I learned through all of this is something every homeowner should know. Authority only matters if it's rooted in fairness, transparency, and truth. Rules exist to protect people, not control them. And no one should ever feel afraid to stand up to someone abusing power, no matter how official or confident they seem. My grandfather built that well with his own hands, never imagining that decades later it would safeguard an entire neighborhood, not just with water, but with the power of truth. It became a symbol of resilience, patience, and the quiet strength of people willing to hold others accountable. If you're dealing with an HOA nightmare, don't give up. Document everything. Know your rights. Speak up when something feels wrong. Sometimes the quietest person in the room, the one who takes notes, gathers facts, and waits for the right moment, is holding all the power. This story wasn't just about a shutoff or a special assessment. It was about community, courage, and the importance of standing for what's right. If you want to hear more true stories like this, hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Your neighborhood might be next, and the more we share, the stronger we all become.